Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm speaking with golf coach Stuart Morgan. Stuart, welcome.
Hey Dan, thanks for so much for having me on. It's a great show that you put on, and really privileged to be on it.
I'm super excited to have you on. We've known each other for very many years now, and I've been longing to get you on to discuss all things coaching. So looking forward to it. Let's start where we always do. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So my background is went down the traditional PGA route. Did my qualification in that, and then decided to just generally specialize in teaching and want to do that full time. My boss at that time was quite a well-renowned coach in that particular area that I did that in. So he's always like a lot of people coming in and so on. There was always sort of like, books and video that you could watch and stuff like this. So you kind of get into it and you start to get immersed in that world. And then when I finished my qualification, I just decided, right, what do I want to do now? So I went to work for David Ledbetter for a long time, and multiple different countries and whatnot, which I feel that helped me on a adaptability for my set to deal with different people. You'd have the very Germanic way; they'd be on the tee like 15 minutes before warming up and whatnot, and you go and work in Spain, and they turn up like 30 minutes late. And it's like it's very different. You have to deal with different people and stuff like that, and it was very very interesting, for me in that. And I owe a huge amount to Led. Led got me involved with, professional players and so on and so forth. And he gave me my first opportunity kind of out on tour working with players. And it was during that time where I got a little bit disillusioned by the whole, okay, well, am I just doing this, And sometimes it would make the player better, sometimes it wouldn't, and I would feel very, very conscientious of that and very guilty of it sometimes, of like if they didn't play so well. And I'm still a little bit like that now, where I take it very much to heart because I generally care. But as we started to go through that, I was like, okay, there must be something else to this. Like, so what is it? I didn't know what that was.
And Stuart, just interjecting, when you say something else, I'm perceiving what you're saying as I was just a swing coach or perceived myself as a swing coach. There's got to be more to it than this.
Yeah, so I was just talking about, okay, put the club there or put the club there,
Yeah.
or make the body do this.
Yeah.
And I'm like going, this can't be just it, And then I just randomly went to a seminar at the Belfry, to do with our CPD. And Graham McDowell was there talking about words that I'd never heard before, like dynamical systems and so on and so forth. But that then sent me down a kind of a whole journey of like, speaking to like Tim Lee, became very friendly with Anders Ericsson, speaking to Robert Bjork and going to UCLA to spend some time with him. And it just opened up a whole new world for me. And then I started to think about, well, why is this starting to actually filter into golf or not? And that's kind of where I got kind of enthused by it. I was very interested in it. Started reading more research papers at that time, which took me ages to get through because I had to just read them like 3 or 4 times to try and decipher what was actually being said in there. And I think that's also kind of been a massive influence of like where I am today, because yes, I'm a golf coach, but I look at more like the practice element of players. And my view on this is that it's no good me having an influence on a player when I'm with them. It's the influence I have on a player when I'm not with them, because they have huge amounts of time on their own. So if they're making kind of good decisions about how they practice, what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, that will start to kind of feed into their game and ultimately make things a little bit more quality. I'm now working for Swiss Golf as a director of performance there, and helping the kind of the pro team in that respect. Started there in 2018. Currently enrolled at the University of Limerick under the brilliant tutelage of John Kiley and Phil Kearney as my supervisors, doing a professional doctorate in in human development and innovation. And that's kind of like, I currently work with players on tour, been to the last 2 Ryder Cups, been involved with players that have won multiple tournaments on the DP World Tour and PGA Tour. And currently I'm kind of in that space of like, yes, practice, but almost like taking a step before the practice and going, what are the beliefs? What are the practice beliefs that players hold that drive their behavior on a day-to-day basis? Because I think we all hold these, and it's interesting for me to know where they come from before I actually start to dive into the absolute practical or the application of what we need to do practically.
I'm going to recap some of this because there's some big names you've thrown in there.
Yeah.
What a history you have. I mean, I am mindful that there are plenty of golf coaches listening in, plenty of people listening in who are interested in, passionate about golf, and there are other coaches from other sports who appreciate golf, but don't necessarily know that landscape so well. You were trained by David Ledbetter, and David Ledbetter was arguably the leading golf coach back in sort of the 80s and 90s, the world famous golf coach who helped Sir Nick Faldo, Nick Price, others to major championship success. So what a fantastic foundation to your golf coaching career after doing the PGA qualifications. And I love the fact that you went abroad and met with people. You spoke about meeting Robert Bjork of Desirable Difficulties fame, world-leading expert on memory and learning. Anders Ericsson, who we've spoken about numerous times on the show, who sadly I never got the opportunity to interview him, and I would have loved to, of deliberate practice fame. Tim Lee, Challenge Point?
Tim, he did. Yeah, but he was also very massive in motor learning, motor control, linked to like Richard Schmidt and whatnot. Unfortunately, I didn't get to meet the late, great Richard Schmidt, which I would have loved to have kind of like had a couple of hours of coffee with him. But Tim's been always gracious to me. And the beauty about these guys, when you reach out to them, they're so gracious with their time and whatnot, and they're very interested in also the practical. They're very theoretical, but they're very they're so interested in the practical nature and what's actually happening on the coalface and on the ground, on a day-to-day basis, and that to me is great. So any coach listening, never think you can't reach out to these guys. Just reach out and see what they say.
Absolutely, and well said. And Tim Lee joined up with Mark Guadagnoli to create the Challenge Point, and recently I've been writing a lot about the extended Challenge Point we had.
Yeah, it's brilliant. But Nicky Hodges and Keith Lowes.
Yeah, Nicky and Keith came onto the show to discuss that. I think it's so relevant for every sport.
Nicky's been great with me as well. Like, I've spoken to her on numerous occasions, and she's always so gracious to send me stuff that's updated and whatnot. And the thing I loved about that framework that they put together was they mentioned transfer in there, which I think is a really interesting concept within sport and whatnot, and especially in my world in practice.
Hugely. And it's so funny we're speaking about this because as we're speaking, the Euros are happening, and I've been talking a lot about the transfer of practice in a football setting, and how the Euros, the immediacy of pressure and the importance of football players being able to pick up the cues, the clues, the triggers of other players around them, to be able to recognize patterns is so important. So the high fidelity of practice, I think, is vital, and that is a big part of the Challenge Point, that practice to transfer to the playing environment. Just picking you up on that idea, you mentioned that at the beginning, when you were reading these papers that would have subsequently led you to contact these researchers, it took you 2 or 3 sort of goes to read them. I can assure you it takes me about 5 or 6 goes still after all these years. But I think that's a really interesting dynamic. And pausing on that for a second, I mean, did you just have a real will, a curiosity built into you to broaden your knowledge base? Were you thinking about returning to academia at that point?
No, not at all. I was just thinking about like that's the one thing I felt more so at the academies with lead, right? When you had, like when I first started working, I came to Austria, actually where I live now, funny enough. But there was like 7 coaches there at that time, and we used to have these like thing called teach-ins
Okay.
every Saturday, where we'd sit down in a room, have a couple of beers and whatnot, and like everybody would talk about certain things and so on and so forth. So it was quite a critical way of like of thinking about things, and in a nice way. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't like you had your director of instruction and whatnot, and he would start to like probe and prompt, like, why did you do that? What was the reason for that? And you just got better at it,
Yeah.
ultimately. And then it was really uncomfortable because you had to film yourself teaching at times and kind of like review it back and so on and so forth. Also, when my final like certification was, you had to go to Champions Gate, where Led's headquarters. They're no longer there, but we went there, sat down. He was in the room. All the coaches there were in the room, and you had to do your final kind of like, let's say, a dissertation, right? Almost like to say, this is what I did, this is why I did it, and you did it in front of all the academy, and they were then able to kind of like critique you or whatnot. And I had the same when I did the performance development systems with Mark Bennett. It was like very critical, but in a good way, right? It was like it didn't, it never feels good, but I think it just makes you look at yourself and look in the mirror and go, do you know what? Yeah, I get that. I can maybe sharpen up on that. I can be better at this. And that's where academia is for me as well. And that's why I kind of like went, it was almost like a journey, of like going, I kind of need something a little bit like that in my life, where I'm evolving, I'm speaking to different people, not just people in the golfing world who bring different perspectives and different understandings. And that's why I went, a couple of years ago, decided to take the plunge and go into that world, into the academia world, and start to do some research myself. But it was very much, Dan, linked to, I'm reading this stuff, and I'm also looking at stuff from like 1980s, right, where um, somebody interviewed like lots of PJ Tour players, played Ryder Cup and whatnot. And I asked like some friends of mine, have you ever heard of this paper? And they're like, no, never heard of it. And I'm like going, but how is this possible? Like this can't. There's a massive disconnect. So that's what the professional doctorate at UL. I feel anyway. I want to try and bring that world a little bit closer, right? And I've already said to the guys, I said, when I write my final dissertation, I don't want to write it as this extreme academic like writing and whatnot. Yes, there needs to be some element of that, but it needs to be translatable for golf coaches. Or how can I turn that into like presentations and not use this type of language? So I think that's kind of where I'm at with that, to be honest.
I love what you're saying, because in many respects, that's the central premise of this podcast, is to try to help translate the research, because I just think there's so much rich information out there that doesn't make its way to the coalface. And I think any medium that helps that to happen is always going to be valuable. Reflecting back some of the things that you said to me there, I love the fact, going back to your time in Austria, that you had what would probably be regarded in academic circles, and we've discussed this on the Sports Soak Show before, a community of practice. And I love the
Yeah,
fact, I mean, we demand in any sport that players come out of their comfort zone, because we probably know that learning happens in environments where it feels a little bit uncomfortable, because you're dealing with movements and experiences and sensorial experiences that are different and feel uncomfortable. That's the same that you experienced there. That's the same you experienced at the Ledbetter Academy at Champions Gate when you were going through your assessment there. And I suppose that's the same to a degree that you're experiencing in your professional doctorate. It's comfort zone busting experiences that help you get better. We want that from our players, but we've got to also do that for ourselves, haven't we, as coaches?
yeah. and just feel what it's like. I think that even when we have, as we go through it, like these, like they're almost like mini Vivas, right? In the sense of like you go in front of a panel and you have to kind of what you're doing, your innovation that you're trying to do, and that's, you have to justify it, and you have to be able to go, and this is why, and this is the underpinning research that we have right now. I just think it makes you better. I think it makes you have a deeper understanding of what's going on ultimately. You can also, when you put in those players through in these challenges, you can have a different level of empathy, because I feel that I have that with the university stuff. Um, Along, when you think back to the playing days, like we would look back, we all had those feelings, no matter what level that you kind of played at. But I also think that with that, what came of me going down this road was I went through certain situations, and I was relatively accomplished in this practice world and working with some players and whatnot. And there's certain player that I kind of came across. I almost couldn't get into them. I couldn't like connect with them. I couldn't sort of have any sort of dialogue, or we just saw the world in a very different way, right? And that's not for them to adapt, that's for me to adapt. So I stepped away from that relationship because of that, because I had to go away and have a think and go, there's something more to this that I'm not picking up on. And that's why the research I'm doing right now is linked to the beliefs of players practice, and where that comes from. Where is that? Why do they do the things that they do? So, like, for example, in your world, like if we look at, there's beliefs around the golf world where players, like or players and managers and caddies, they dismiss the fact of, oh, we need to train a little bit under pressure, or we need to do some, add a little bit of context, or add a little bit of needle to the practice session. But there's this belief around, yeah, but it can never be the same as tournament play, right?
Oh yes, yeah.
But that's a belief. And when I start looking at that, and I go, but actually, if we look at Sion Bylock's research to do with like choking and stuff like that, I don't even know. Like, there's a 2010 paper by Orjans and Pfeiffer talking about this same thing. It doesn't need to be exactly the same.
No.
And there's enough. So that's me in the practical world going, okay, this is what you believe, right? And you've created this belief from somewhere. But before we can actually have any type of intervention for more adaptation with these players or whatnot, we have to somehow challenge that belief, and we have to show them that there are other options here. And that's, for me, is what's interesting. So instead of going like full gung ho in there and going, right, you need to do this for your practice, you need to do this, it's not about that. It's finding out where their stance is right now, what they're doing. If we look at the brilliant research by Ali Crum at Stanford to do with, changing somebody's mindsets around certain things, again, much more in your world.
Yep.
But I dive into that because I need to know what their beliefs are around practice. If they think I need to go out there and just shell balls for like 8 hours a day, where does that come from? I can't just go like wading in there and go, oh, we need to change this. So yeah, that's the long-winded element of like where that kind of journey has kind of taken me to this day.
Well, everything you're saying there makes me think of the 5-stage model of change: the pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and then maintenance. And it's that when you're as a golf coach, when you're with a client or a pupil, if you want to call them that, a player, that they might be in that pre-contemplation stage, and you've got to take them to the contemplation and then onwards. So as you were speaking, it was really making me think of that 5-stage model, and I'd like to just pause and dig a little bit deeper into that, and again, completely respecting privacy, confidentiality as to who this
Yeah.
specific person was, but what I'm hearing you say, so you're a golf coach, you're a PGA golf coach, you've had these wonderful comfort zone busting experiences, you're working probably across a range of population, but you're working with this very, very good player. And I'm assuming this player is a professional player. And what I think I'm hearing you say is that you feel there's, this player has to change something with regard to how they're practicing, and they stubbornly refuse to change. And that's made you think, rather than going away and saying, wow, this player just doesn't know what they're doing and what a nightmare and I can't help them and they can't help themselves, you've gone away and gone, hang on. I need to find a way. This is a belief system about practice. I need to find a way to break this down. So again, respecting what you can and can't say about this, but if you were to sum up how this player wanted to practice their golf and how the approach you wanted this player to take, are you able to share anything there?
Yeah, so they had this withheld belief that they had to swing it mechanically in a particular way, right? And it was linked to a model of how to swing the golf club. And, I'm looking at this going, well, yeah, we could, you can contrive this to how you want to, but at the end of the day, we're trying to develop adaptable athletes to what the demands are that they're going to come across ultimately. So I'm looking at this from a not just that viewpoint of belief, but I'm looking at the age of the athlete, where they are in their career, all these other factors to go, dude, like, I don't even think you have time to do this, right? So if we're talking about, the movement science of like, stable states in space of like where somebody is kind of drawn towards, you're thinking, man, to really change that, can we not just find a way of adapting this and being a little bit more accepting with this,
Right.
and looking at it less on that fixed model of something, but a little bit more like skill based, like what, like you. And that's the thing. I was asking him, you tell me the demands that you're having. But the thing was, when I started to kind of go back and I started to kind of understand, he was very, there was very much a story that he'd kind of had around why this was so important to him, right? Because he associated this, I need to do it this way, and I changed this with the success that he had. And that creates a very kind of really deep lying kind of belief there that this is what I have to do. But we know as we kind of move through, at that point, he was 23, 24 years of age, no problem, easy, quite simple to do. We're still very, malleable in our brains at that point. But as we start to go through and we get older and we've had a little bit more experiences, we have to somehow shift, right? Not still keep doing your checkpoints, still doing this, still, key things with your setup and so on and so forth. But let's try and get a little bit more bang for the buck here and try and make the boat go faster in maybe a different way. But he just didn't want to see it, right? And that's why I had to go away and go, all right, let me figure out like what this is about here.
So you can only hypothesize this, but if you were to get in a time machine and go back, and obviously we're going to continue to explore how things evolved for you and where you've taken this, but if you were to get in a time machine and go back, what would you do differently? Would you do anything
Yeah, I
differently?
think I would I've thought about this a lot as well, and I think it's made me a better coach kind of going forward, because I and that's really linked to that belief element, to sit down with a player and start to ask them, okay, or just spend some time with them. Okay, in this situation, what are you trying to do? What are your beliefs around this? How are you going to train this? Um, and then start to, like, in the again, the research world that I'm doing, we started doing some pilots, and we have this like practice map that we have now, where the player gives us an overview of a couple of weeks training session when they're not at a tournament, and also what happens at a tournament. And then we start to go through the rigor of like questioning, why are they doing this, what's the reason, where did this belief kind of come from. So I would probably do that, Dan, to be honest, and very much meet him a little bit kind of closer to where he was, rather than what my view is. It was almost like he's here, I'm thinking of where I want to get him to, right, in that standpoint, just to balance out these things. But I needed to take a few more steps towards him, and we just kind of organically grow together in that respect. So that would be where my time machine would go.
You've mentioned practice maps, and I'd like to unpack this. So, around, I think you said around 2008, you're a PGA coach. You're coaching some great players, professional players, including the player you've just spoken about there. You're probably coaching a range of populations, as we've said. But you're inching closer towards, you want to evolve your coaching into something else, and that's what you've done. You've become, as much as anything, a practice coach. And as a sports psychologist, I often say this on the show, I take a very broad definition of sports psychology. I think, we need to be hungry for knowledge around learning and skill acquisition and coaching science. I think as a sports psychologist, I can be heavily involved there. So everything we're about to talk about is a passion of mine as well. So take me back to sort of that time, and you're thinking, okay, I want to broaden things out here and be a practice coach, if that's the right term for it. Tell me about the genesis of this, the early periods of this. What did this look like at the beginning? What conversations were you having with players? How did this start, and how did it start to evolve?
Yeah, so I think what started to happen was, like anything, I heard some stuff at a seminar, and I started going, okay, like where can I learn more about this, and so on and so forth, and just went down that road, and I didn't even know what Google Scholar was at that time, to be quite honest. And I didn't even know this world kind of existed. And then I started to kind of get again a few more papers on certain things, and that kind of led to one thing and led to another thing. And then you start to go, okay, I'm still a golf coach at that time. We start putting some of the, not just like, okay, this is what I want you to do, but this is how I want you to do it. Like as we evolve here, and we're gonna spend a little bit more time on that, rather than just, we kind of know what to do. And then you start to kind of see things, and you go, oh, right, okay, that seems to be, that seems to be good. That's not so good. This may be too demanding for that player. This is not demanding enough for this player. So that's kind of like the challenge point element. Started creating some things on the golf course to kind of match. So it wasn't just like range based, so much more playing related. Also during that time, started watching players play more in competition, which was like the best decision I probably ever made as a coach, to see what's happening under the pump. And then we have some, again, different discussions from there. And as you know, is that if you're kind of passionate about something, or you're kind of really inquisitive about something, things can start to escalate pretty quickly, because you start to open up a whole new world. Like when I started to speak to Anders and started to speak to, Tim Lee, and I always remember this story of, I was at UCLA, and I took a student there, right, because they were contemplating, going to play collegiate golf there. And I was like, look, I'm really sorry to one of the coaches. I think it was one of the assistants at that time. I said, I need to go. I have an appointment with Dr. Robert Bjork up in the, to do with like memory and stuff. And they were like, who's he? And I'm like going, what? Like, I'm in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, everybody should know who this guy is. Like, especially in the golf world, maybe they bring him in to help. But even in the university, like the golf coach, they didn't know who this guy was, and he was literally 500 yards away, in a different building, an absolute gem of a human being, I'm thinking, how is that possible? Like how like I couldn't get my head around it. And again, I just kept evolving in that and learning more and applying it and reflecting on it. And not like in an invasive way, but it was more like let's just can we try this out a little bit, because I think this will really help you. And it did, right? And then what at one point I was living in the US and working at a junior school there to try and help players go to play collegiate golf. And when I came back from there, we moved to Austria again. And at that time, there was a player here who he turned around to me one day, and I'd known him for a long time, and he goes, "I'm just bored, Stu, with my practice. I'm so bored. I've been doing this. I've won a few times on tour. Is there anything, do you know?" And it just like happened to be at that time that I'd been on this journey for probably 10 years. And I felt like, do you know what? I feel I have some tools to be able to help you here. And we tried it, and we kind of said, okay, he got a wrist injury. So he came back from the wrist injury. He couldn't hit the volume of balls that he used to hit. So we had to get creative and go, well, let's just make every ball count. Really simple. Has a consequence to this. You're kind of trying to hit it there, trying to shape it to there. We're trying to mix and match. We went like driver, approach play, putting, then went out on the golf course and do like certain similar things just to make it a little bit more like challenging for him. And he goes, "Oh, I love this. This is so much better."
So that, please excuse me, just interjecting a
Yeah.
second. This, you said this was a player who'd won a few times on
Oh
tour. So
yeah.
this is not this is a very, very accomplished professional. To win on tour, you've got to be exceptional. So he's won on tour, and he's come to you and said, "Look, I'm a bit bored here." So my interpretation of what you're saying is that what you've introduced to him, you talked about tools. You've introduced to him a sense of variability. You've introduced a sense of fidelity of practice, utilizing the course. You've introduced maybe some spacing or interleaving. I mean, could you dive in, and again, respecting what you can and can't share, but dive into the specifics of maybe what he was doing, and then with you what he started to do? I know you've kind of skirted on it, but could you be specific?
Yeah. So that's where again I think I'd matured a little bit at that time.
Yeah.
I'd sat down with him and say, "Well, what are you doing now?" Um, and then it was like, "Oh, well, I grew up in this world. This is what I was told to do." So again, he's telling me his
Yes.
beliefs,
Yes.
right? But I'm just not using those. I didn't know those words in that sense at this time. So I'm asking him, why do you do that? Where's that come from? Oh, it's come from this. Okay, well, why is that been good for you at this certain time? Well, I feel like I had loads of energy, loads of time. You know, didn't have any other kind of things to do in sense, just like play golf and hit balls and so on. Okay, that's fine. Maybe it's just the right time to kind of do that. I said, but you said to me that you're bored. What's boring about your practice? And he said, it's just monotonous. And I was like, oh, right, okay. And it's not until later you start to kind of, I was speaking to Damien Farrow about his paper
Mm.
with Robertson about skill periodization, and tedium kind of comes up in that paper. So I wasn't until years later, but I started to then go, that's what he's telling me, ultimately. So what we did was saying, okay, he then had a wrist injury, he was out of the game for a little bit, comes back and said, look, this gives us a great opportunity now to be able to maybe try something different here, and we'll give it a go. You tell me how it kind of feels to you. So instead of like the really massing of what he was doing, hitting that over repetitive element, we said, I asked him, what does golf demand of you? How do you play the game? How do you see the game? And he went, I see it like this. I shape it into flags. I hit different things. Okay, is that how you are, or like what that just matches for you? How do you see it? Like what do you do? Do you feel it? Do you see it? Do you do all of it? He's like, yeah, I kind of do all of it, but I'm much better when I react to flights and that I see to situations and stuff. I was like, okay, that's brilliant. So then we created tasks using some technology, like using TrackMan, for example. But we almost halved his practice time, Dan, from what he was doing previously. So we then started to go, okay, well, let's just, instead of just hitting lots of drivers, where you go, I'm going to hit like 10 drivers in a row, why not just hit a driver if we're working on that, but then also hit an approach shot in between that driver? So we're going more between skill variability rather than just within skill variability. So we did that, and he was like, "Oh my god, I did like 90 minutes like training like this. I was knackered because I was like mentally tired. Okay, well, let's now add some parameters to what we're trying to do here. So some margins, we called it. And then we categorized certain things, and we like certain yardage buckets where he was looking at his stats and whatnot. Okay, you're going to play more shots from this region, less from here, a few from here. So let's like look at this and let's shape how you're practicing around this. But the big thing that we did, we never did anything on the range that we couldn't replicate on the golf course. So any form of like task we did on the practice facility, he could also go and do that and drop balls down on the golf course and actually match that that intensity and that intention of what he was trying to do. And all of a sudden, just, we started to see more of this transfer effect kicking in. There was less regression when he had time away. So it wasn't like, okay, you have 2 weeks off where you haven't hit any golf balls, but he didn't have to get back in and just like go shell, hit loads and loads of balls. The regression period was much shorter, so we could move forward quicker. Does that make sense?
100%. And I just want to track back slightly because I'm also intrigued by your coaching process here at the beginning, which had changed as a consequence of perhaps not such a successful experience historically. You, in that initial conversation, you met him where he was at. Which I think is so important and far more difficult to do than to say. Because to say it sounds, well, yeah, okay, you're going to do that, but you've got so much swimming around in your head, haven't you? I mean, I experienced this in my consultancy practice. You've got, especially working with coaches, you've got so much that you think, I need to say this, I need to add this because there's going to be so much value here for this person. And it's like, no, stop. Like Dr. Ed Corlin says, tell yourself to shut up 3 times until you do, right?
Yeah.
And then I love what you did. For me, what I heard you do is that you pointed out the strengths of what he was doing in his context. You were young, you had energy. This helped you at that time. You hit lots of golf balls. It helped you become who you are today. So you were actually, again, to almost like the bookends of coaching connection. You're meeting them where they're at, and then you're pointing out the strengths of what they were doing. So you're kind of onboarding this player. And then you're asking questions around his game. You're some discovery questions around his game. And then you're adding some tools. And those tools are really driven in 2 ways: fidelity of practice, or we could use representation or high specificity. It's got to have the same informational components as on the golf course, as close as possible, and also data driven. So what's the data say? So I really, really love that process. And then I love that feedback of, he was saying how exhausted he was. And, a selfish point here, I tend to work around 3 mental skills. So if I narrow everything down, I talk about attention, intensity, and intent. Attention, intensity, intent, and making sure that every practice shot is done so with attention, intensity, and intent. And that does lead to fatigue, neural fatigue.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, but what I will say, the interesting thing about what came from that, it was like, that moment of like, oh, I've got it. I figured it all out here, and then you start going, oh, this person needs to do that. And that's where I failed again. So, like in the future, I said to you about, I tried to get this player to do things too quick,
Yep.
and he was a completely different person, right? Because I'm thinking, well, I've had a perceived level of like influence and success of this. So I like literally jump forward too much and going, oh yeah, I figured this out. This is what we need to do. But that player was a different person. His beliefs were different. His history was different. And that's what I kind of evolved into, which I think, I would say I'm very self-critical. So it's not like I just leave these things go and just like let them blow over my head. Like I sit with them. And again, it comes back to that uncomfortableness. You sit, this doesn't feel good. I need to figure out what I did, why I did it, why it didn't work. Can I evolve? Can I learn, from this? And there's some principles with it. What we did there was it wasn't always the case of going, okay, this is what we need to do all the time either. So we evolved this to go, well, actually, when you get to like the tournament end, like when you're at a tournament potentially, I don't want you kind of cooking yourself there. Like I don't want you to be fatigued after a practice session. I just want you to almost go, all right, I'm just going to kind of a little bit go through the motions, do what I need to do, potentially more massing of practice if that's what they feel they need to do. Low cognitive demand, but they're engaged in I'm getting ready to play here, right? So it's like I call it like this. I have this like develop, train, perform like framework. So develop, we kind of like explore and whatnot. Train, I'm going right. I need some, I need some kind of challenge, a bit more kind of stress, a little bit of like allostasis kicking in here because we need to move the player forward. But I don't really want to do that, too close to the event, and then I come down off the wave, to the performance. And this is what drives me crackers because when I see players do, or some coaches do this, what they call performance training. Well, performance to me in the term of it is that we see in performance improvements in that moment, right? And good things happening. It doesn't mean learning's happened, it just means something is good in that moment. So if I don't think performance practice is increasing challenge, increasing this, I think performance is much more maintenance, stability, and whatnot. I look at training, so my red phase for me in this practice framework. I look at that more like this high challenge, high demand, and whatnot. So I think sometimes we get it kind of the wrong way around. That's how I view it anyway.
I'd like to talk more about that. Working backwards there, it's interesting. So you're not one dimensional in what you're promoting. That their blocked practice, if we want to call it that or massed practice, has become these have become swear words in our world, right? But
Yeah, I
and I
know. Yeah.
completely agree with you here that their context and we've talked about individual differences making a difference, but context matters, right?
Yeah, so if I'm at a tournament, and I've been at major tournaments with players, right, and they've come off the round, and we've had some like some hot feedback, like straight away, right, because they're. But then I turn around to them and say, "What do you feel you need to do now?" For me, I have maybe some preferences in that respect, but if they feel they need to go, I drove it terrible today. I need to just go and hit 25 drivers, right, in a block or in a group. I just need to figure out what's going on here. I have no problem with that. Like what they feel in that moment is probably what's going to be good for them kind of going forward. But if we're in a different phase, right, and we're 3 weeks out from a tournament and they're choosing to do that, I'm probably going to intervene and go, I think we can do this better. I think we can get more out of this training here. But at the tournament, they're under enough challenge. They're under enough And I think this is also what happens was when people see, I think elite players are very, very switched on, Dan. I think they figure out things, right? And I think what they figure out things, what works for them. So when people are watching these guys practice at a tournament and they see them just like doing this like repetitive over and over and over ball, well, first of all, we don't really know what they're doing in that moment, but it might look to the outside public that they're just
Mm,
massing their practice. But maybe
mm,
that's what they need
mm.
at that time. So I think I'm relatively flexible in that, and like, more along the lines of, okay, well, what do we need at this particular time? You know, if a player turns around, they come off the golf course, they're bringing the flags in, and they shoot 76 at a tournament, and then they want to come off and still hit some balls. I'm probably going to manage that situation based on where I kind of feel that they're at, how tired they are. They might have an early tee time the next day, you know, but that's to me some of the skills of being around that environment that you just pick up in that moment.
Have you ever had to? It's such a different world, golf coaching, than to say football, soccer, um, rugby, basketball, NFL, where you're a coach, head coach, or assistant coach of a team. And in many respects, even though we talk more these days about the importance of autonomy supportive coaching, those teams have leaders, and those leaders are the coaches. So in many respects, what the coach says by and large goes. Golf coaching, you're being employed, or as a practice coach, you're being employed. If a player is saying, no, I don't like that, I want to do this, I hear what you're saying with regard to, say, on an eve of a tournament, that might be a context where I have to listen to my player.
Yeah.
How do you provide pushback, and how much pushback do you feel as a practice coach of these tour players? How much pushback can you give them if you feel that they're making a decision that is to the detriment of their game?
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is that if they, especially at a tournament, right? If they think that, especially after rounds and whatnot, okay, this is what I need to do. This is what I feel I need to do right now. I'm going to kind of more trust their intuitive nature of, they're out there in the heat of battle. They know kind of what's going on. They know their standards and whatnot. I'm not really going to create any more freaking noise in their world right now. Um,
Okay.
if I Let's say if it's like they've played in the morning and then they've had they've had lunch and whatnot, and they've kind of like defused. They've had a good day or they've had a bad day. Then there's probably a different, context conversation to be had, right? So I look at it like this and go, there's conversations going on. If we're trying to learn something or improve performance at something pre-tournament, we should be doing different things than what we do necessarily at a tournament. And that's also kind of led by them as well. Like I don't feel like I just need to tell them what to do. They're elite competitors. At times I'm listening to them more than I'm saying anything to them. So that's yeah, that's that. And again, sometimes I'm going off in the moment as well. What do I feel is the right thing to do? I'm almost thinking about it like two holes before I even get to the end. What am I going to say here? Like, what am I preparing here to kind of to talk about? But that's coaching, isn't it? Like that's like that's how I see it. I don't think it's anything other than just being in tune with what's going on.
Talking about coaching, you mentioned earlier that you're quite self-critical. And I would imagine that you've got to have a certain degree of confidence to work with tour golfers, professional tour golfers. How do you balance that? How do you retain a sense of confidence in what you're delivering and yet engage in a self-critical voice in order to check and challenge yourself with the goal of improving?
I think what comes with me is, I definitely think. that having people around me to kind of bounce things off that are kind of that hold the mirror up, and like,
Critical friend.
yeah, like Ed, I call them like my knights of the round table, right? So that's my kind of framework of them, and people change at different times, right? But go through like Ed, for example, that we've spoken about. Like, I'll pick up the phone to Ed, and he's a real critical voice for me, and I'll talk to him about different things and
Dr. Ed
whatnot.
Corlin.
Ed Kellon,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, and he has been for a number of years now. Dave Allred was for a period of time. When I was in a different space, and you'd have like different people sitting there. So I think it's like I just need to run something past you. My supervisors at university, because they're coming at it from a different perspective than me, and sometimes it's like I did what I did in the moment, or I said what I said in the moment, and sometimes you just go, okay, I can learn from that, and I can be critical and whatnot, but I still feel I have kind of a lot of tools at my disposal within me to be able to help these players. And I think I have what I would say, from that journey since like 2008 or whatever it was, I felt like I've built up a good kind of library of things that I can draw upon, and enough kind of information and knowledge and experience to be able to draw upon, and enough people that I can pick up the phone to and ask a question or send a message to, that I can draw upon. So it's not, you're never doing it alone, are you? At the end of the day.
Social support as a way to critically reflect and to maintain a sense of confidence. I'd love to close our conversation today with just a little bit of a short exploration around performance under pressure and practicing for pressure. And we're almost coming full circle to one of the things you said at the beginning of the episode today, and that was, some certain gripes from certain caddies, maybe even players, coaches, etc., who might say, "Well, you can't replicate pressure," and you've mentioned that research suggests that you don't have to fully replicate. But what are the kinds of things, if I may ask, what are the kind of things that you're doing to ramp up the volume of stress, pressure, if you want to use that term?
Yeah. So, but I also think, yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think people sometimes get task difficulty mixed up with pressure training sometimes
Okay.
from where I feel. So I think like pressure training for me is, coming up with some kind of consequence that is relevant to that individual. Some players might be, wired to score, or wired to cash, or wired to sweets, or, whatever it might be. It's very different.
Doing the dishes.
Yeah, whatever, but also in that scenario, you don't want to give away like all your secrets. But I've also found that layering on to go to a player, like let's say you set a task for them, and you say, this task is super easy. You should get this done in absolutely no time whatsoever.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, there's no consequence in that. And there's no like perceived like punishment or whatnot. It's just reframing something. So it adds a little bit more noise to what they're kind of doing ultimately. But when it comes to like task difficulty, that's looking at skill. That's like looking at the challenge point. That's looking at what I call that training wave, right? But I also need to look at where I go is I need to look at that and manage that around their tournament schedule as well. And I need to pay attention to, do they want more of that closer to the tournament? So do we move the wave closer, or do we move the wave further away? And then you start to go into, into that kind of skill periodization element of practice ultimately. So I think pressure training is finding that biting point for that individual, and it only needs to be. So let's say somebody's you're trying to close out a tournament, right? And you go, okay, that's great. Well, if we look at like top level players, if you say something, oh, you need to close out these 3 holes, well, that maybe not give that might not give it to them. But if you draw out the time frame to say, right, we need to get to this score, right, for 15 holes,
Yeah.
right, and then we close out for the next 4 holes, right? Then all of a sudden, but if we don't, we're going to go again for another 3 holes or another 6 holes. So all of a sudden, if they have to go, they've done something for a period of time, and then you have to like jump them backwards. For a good player, that's probably adds a little bit more spice to it. And it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't have to be the exact same thing.
No.
It just needs to be, there needs to be just a little bit of bite in there for me. Like you can almost see the behaviors like you would do if you watched them play.
So you're setting some contextual challenges there and playing about with context.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And talk to me a little bit about the current research papers, the current topics that you're throwing around with your round table, and the thoughts that you're mulling over with respect to the experiences you're having every day as you move into the future.
Yeah, so there's some stuff that I've been kind of quite interested in. Like there's a brilliant paper, I think it's 2021, from Enos Hippolito and Carl Friston, to do with this, where does skill come from, right? So it's linked to the predictive processing research and whatnot, because when you listen to Carl Friston and you read this paper, you start to kind of look at it. It's not top down. It's not bottom up. It's an accumulation of all,
Yes.
Right? And it's this embodiment of performance. Yes, the environment has an impact. Yes, the situations have an impact. But also in golf, there is also some pre-planning stuff going on. There is information that's come from the past and things that you've kind of have in your memory and what. I can't. When I started looking into it, it's like that accumulation of that connection of all the worlds ultimately. And what it really comes down to from that, I think I can't remember what it's called. I think it's like active inference,
yes,
or
it's active inference, free energy principle.
Yeah. So when I look at that, I'm thinking, ultimately it's linked to, energy conservation. I think Lisa Feldman Barrett talks a little bit about it as well.
Yes.
So what I see is skill, neuroscience, philosophy, a lot of these worlds start to kind of connect. And that's kind of interesting for me, to be honest. And also, tapping into, I read recently I think her name is Talia Sharot, like on beliefs and how beliefs change and things like this. Still very interested in the infancy of skill periodization, I think, and how we kind of that's more like my immediate world of how I can get better at that. But yeah, it's kind of a lot going on, and I'm very interested, like speaking through some of the pilot studies that I'm doing at the moment, and then looking at the coding of what words and what themes come up with what they're speaking about. It's very, very interesting, and it gets me to really think about, what can I do with practice? My goal is lofty. I want to try and improve it in golf and want to get people to think about maybe some different things and whatnot. But it's still taking that one person and that one person only, and saying, what do you need to do, or what can I help you with?
Yeah, and your last point there is an interesting juxtaposition, isn't it? Because you've said some really interesting names there. Tali Sharot, who, I think her first book was about the optimism bias, which is again using that word juxtaposed against Professor Martin Seligman's thesis on the essentially a negative bias of the brain. So the brain has an optimism bias, a negative bias. It's I suppose quite chaotic. But you also there mentioned Professor Carl Friston, the neuroscientist from University College London, and the most cited neuroscientist on
Yeah,
planet
he is.
Earth
Yeah,
ever, and an absolute genius. And his work on free energy principle, predictive processing, active inference, and I know there's a lot of good people, in sport behind the scenes starting to become interested and engaged in that from a research perspective. Not least, we had John Mackey on from Island Canoeing and
yeah, I know John. Yeah,
combat
yeah.
coach, and he's doing a lot of work there. And I think I've actually dipped into the paper you've spoken about there, and it's very much we have a map of our world, and we are the map of the world. Essentially,
That's right. Yeah.
that's the one that takes about not 5 or 6 times to read, but about 15 or 16 times to read to go.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay,
some of the active inference stuff.
yeah.
I mean, it's too dense for me. Like, I can't get my head around the maths and stuff like that. But yeah, like my supervisor John Kiley, now he's been brilliant. Like, he wrote a really good paper in 2012, which challenged the physical periodization, and linked to evidence led or traditions driven, and it's like he's a very kind of good critical thinker in a very good way, trying to move things forward. And I've been very lucky to have him, and with skill acquisition with Phil Kearney now, to piece these worlds together and try and get that the practice element kind of to chat. It's not easy challenging, Dan, is it? Like, people push back all the time, and they kind of, some people take it really personal and whatnot, and that's not really what we're trying to do. We're just trying to help people when it comes down to it.
Well, we're trying to figure it out, and nobody really has
Yeah,
fully
yeah,
figured it out, right? And again, to come back to the predictive process and free energy principle. I mean, the active inference is very much. I have a model of my world. My interpretation is I have a model of my world, and that I embody and enact that model. I can embody and enact a model, and that will create a model of my world. So it's very much that. That capacity to change behavior and change the model of my world, which I think is really, really interesting. It's sort of the embodiment and an action. So I think that's a fascinating thing for sport. And
we've tried to look at it a lot with, when we see like the
okay.
transition of players, right? Really simply is to go, well, actually, if the prediction gap is too big, right? So when they arrive somewhere,
Yeah.
and it's like, oh my God,
Yes.
I'm not prepared for this, right? So what we're trying to do now in training and in practice is trying to almost like close that prediction gap ultimately, and get the players much more prepared for the levels. So it's not just saying to them, oh yeah, you want to get to this level and you jump up to this level and jump. No, we want to get you prepared for whatever you're going to come to deal with. Pins look like they're hanging off the edge of greens, which you haven't seen before, thick or rough. So we're just trying to close that gap. Is it more demanding? 100%. But when they arrive, like in 2018, when I started working for Swiss Golf, they hadn't had a professional on tour for 20 years. And all of a sudden, well, you start to figure out all these little bits of potentially why that might be, but we just try and start to close the gap, and that's trying to close the gap on standards and what they're going to expect when they get there.
And I think what you're saying is really interesting. And again, I think in line with that model, I remember speaking to, just before I was lead site for England Golf, I went and visited England Golf, and I was speaking to former amateur number one Gary Woolstenholme, who
Yeah. Yeah.
many people listening, and some will know, some won't know, but he was a top English amateur golfer, career amateur golfer. And he was renowned as, a very good player, very good amateur player, a great chipper and putter, but perhaps didn't send it out too far, wasn't a hugely long hitter. And I was just speaking with him, and at the time he had been practicing a little bit, I think, with Justin Rose, or he had played a tournament and played with Justin Rose and some others. And he was talking about how he found himself hitting the ball further because he was playing with these players who were, let's say, at that time hitting and I'm going back over a decade, a 7-iron, 170 yards, which at that time would have been, reasonably big, reasonably long. And he just said, you start to embody that. I mean, I'm paraphrasing him, but you start to embody that world, and you get your 7-iron out 170, and there's just a shift there. And I don't want to sound too funky here, but yeah, there is just something. I'm not suggesting everybody can start to hit it like Bryson DeChambeau, but I think there are some shifts can be made depending on the models of the world, because you haven't got that prediction error. And to speak to your point, you're trying to minimize prediction error. And I go back to my own experiences when I turned up to the 1998 final qualifying of the British Open, and I was a fish out of water. So a fish out of water is basically, in newer scientific terms, I'm experiencing a lot of prediction errors. So really, in the lead up to that, I needed to have gone and embodied and enacted, have the sensorial experiences, embodied and enacted what I was going to experience, at Hillside at that time. And so I
had a similar experience, but more like the thing which kind of hit me was more football related. So when I went to my first trials at a professional club, and you go and trial there, and you kind of play against the players that have already been there, and they're quicker, they think quicker. They're like, you almost like, when I remember first going there, I didn't know where the players were. Like, they were moving like constantly, and I wasn't prepared for that. So all of a sudden it created a kind of a high level of stress for me, and it was difficult. But again, that's where I think also coaching can help to be able to go. And again, it comes down to, I think that's where we've been relatively successful with Swiss golf, and we've still got a long way to go, is that I came in, I had a little bit of tour experience at that time, so I was able to close that gap a little bit for them. They hadn't had that before. So it's like, okay, well, these are the skills we need. This is where we need to get to, and let's kind of work towards that.
Interesting. Well, we took a 10-minute extra deep dive there into the world of
We could have gone on for another 90 minutes, I think, with that.
Well, yeah, because I just think that's why I really like predictive processing. I plan to speak more about this on the Sports Soap show, but I really like it because it really does resonate with me. The notion of having a model in our world, but enacting that model, and that's more active inference.
And you see the language that they use in the papers and what. It's very much from both worlds, from this kind of tug of war that seems to be going on from the these skill frameworks and whatnot.
Direct and indirect perception. It's the meeting of the two.
It is. That to me is what's kind of interesting for me.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's a generative model. So, well, let's stop geeking out and we'll let you go. Look, Stuart, thank you so much for your time today. Really, really fascinating, and congratulations with all your fantastic work out there in the world of golf. How can people find you, follow you, and get in touch?
Yes, so I've with a colleague of mine, Peter Arnott, we've put together an education kind of online thing called Practice Thinkers, and that's really what it is. It's to try and help people think about their practice. So what we're trying to do with that is there's an educational framework for coaches, and we're putting an educational framework for players together, and it's going to kind of connect together. And it all comes down from that vision of, if we can really help the golfers that we're working with when we're not around, then that's where I think we make the biggest gains. Personally, it's not when we're with them; it's what they're doing when we're not with them. Ultimately, so you can go on practicethinkers.com, and if you want to follow me on social, it's Stuart M Coaching. And that's on X and on Instagram. So I'll post on there now and again.
Stuart, thanks so much for today.
Dan, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast episode, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.